with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark.
At the close of the Age of Fire, all lands meet at the end of the earth. A great tide of human enterprise, all for naught.
So, the last DLC of Dark Souls 3 has been finally released, and I believe I'm not the only one to whom it caused some very strong emotions, being the last DLC of, apparently, the last Dark Souls game. And, having that said, although it's possibly going to be difficult, in this video I'd like to talk about the general impression from the Ringed City and some very peculiar things about it. So, speaking of impressions, I guess we should mention the level design, which is absolutely great. Not only the locations look absolutely beautiful and convey the atmosphere of the world we find ourselves in, but they are also extremely interesting to explore, being quite complicated, with all those shortcuts, detours, hidden ways, Dark Souls are known for. I'd even say that in terms of world design quality, this DLC is more akin to Dark Souls 1 than anything in Dark Souls 3. As for the things we expected from it, for instance, indeed as we speculated in the first videos about Ashes of Ariandel, the second DLC does involve Uncle Gael in search of the pigment for the painter. But generally, I guess it gave us both the things that were expected and that were unexpected. At least, to me it was neither a disappointment, nor a boring thing. And actually I found some stuff that was really exciting to me that I'd like to discuss, thus let's finally proceed to some more specific interesting things and basically the DLC itself. So, it begins when we arrive to the Dreg Heap, a place at the very end of the world, where the great ruins of civilizations of different ages converge together. And even before we plunge into it, we meet a very peculiar character, who sits admiring the view of civilization's collapse. She refers to herself as a stone hump hag, and, although apparently not too willing to deal with us at first, she reveals us the nature of the place and shows knowledge of the story of the world and the Ringed City particularly. But I believe that it's her identity that is the most intriguing to us. As in her dialogues she mentions speaking with Prince Lorien of Lothric Kingdom, and, although her appearance isn't much different from ordinary pilgrims, many of whom may be seen at the entrance to Lothric's cathedral, there is another hint to her possible connection to Lothric's rulers that may be found in description of old woman's ashes left by her. As it reveals that she once used to be a wet nurse of royalty, which, in Lothric Kingdom, was a role played by the High Priestess. Thus, obviously she reminds us of Emma the High Priestess of Lothric. And we actually see her sitting on a somewhat similar, yet broken chair. However, there is also another character who seems to be related both to Emma and Stone Hump Hag, the Shrine Handmaid. In fact, it is her who sells us the High Priestess ring in the Dark Firelink Shrine, and basically we may see this very ring depicted on the old woman's ashes, and she also used to sit on a somewhat similar chair. On the other hand, when we first meet Stone Hump Hag, she expects us to think that she would be brimming with goodies and that we're interested in buying something from her. And, although it's also possible that her assumption is caused by the fact that many mistake her for a merchant similar to Shrine Handmaid, she does sell some goods, quite similar to those sold by Shrine Handmaid, but also related to Queen of Lothric. And, for example, since I guess we can't really rule out the possibility that during the different generations Lothric Kingdom had different High Priestesses. For instance, there are several statues resembling women in High Priestess attire above Lothric Cathedral doors. Though it's a vague point, the revealed connections may lead us to some very peculiar speculations regarding the relation between Emma, Shrine Handmaid and Stone Hump Hag. For instance, being similar both to Shrine Handmaid and Emma, Stone Hump Hag may possibly allow us not to consider that Shrine Handmaid sells Priestess ring by chance, not being related to Lothric herself. Also, when dying, the hag suggests that she may get to see an angel, which is peculiar, since it's said that angelic faith wasn't officially recognized by any of Lothric's pillars of rule, including High Priestess. Yet, as we discussed it in the older videos, Gertrude, who had a contact with angels, was experimented upon in Grand Archives, and Prince Lothric's magic is actually somewhat similar to the magic used by pilgrim angels. But, let's return to the discussion of the DLC. So, one of the first things you notice when following messages left by Uncle Gael is that gravity is way more forgiving at the Dreg Heap, and to me it appeared to be similar to the way we had to fall into the abyss of New Londo with Covenant of Artorias in Dark Souls 1. Basically, before playing the game myself and watching only gameplay videos, I thought that this peculiar thing about the gravity was caused by the nature of this place, which could be related to the abyss, for we find enemies who make liquid sounds and use dark magic of some bluish hues reminding of the deep sea. but now it seems that it could rather be caused by some charms left for us by Gael, as we can find these marks, very similar to the effect of miracles, only black. Though, they still could be simply markers to show us the place where to fall. But that would be weird in case we fall into the Grand Archive's ruin. And, I'd also like to mention another peculiar little thing regarding Gael's messages, as they seem to be burning, smoking with humanity, Skull Flame, which we'll get a chance to see again further in the DLC. Though, I guess that it's simply done to distinguish developer-left messages from user messages and make them more noticeable. But anyway, following the steps of Slave Knight Gael, we make our way through the ruins of different ages and cultures of old, until we reach the great cavity carved out of a great arc tree, which is reminiscent of Great Hollow of Dark Souls 1, but of course it's not necessarily the same arc tree. Its deep bottom became the last hiding place of the Demon Prince, whose flame is already familiar to us from Prince Lorien's sword that once delivered a defeat upon the Demon Prince, and upon finishing Lorien's job of slaying the great bat demons, we proceed to so much familiar ruin of the old fire-linked Shrine of Lordan, and through the hole from which King Seekafrant used to appear, and through which we were able to get to the Firelink altar. We reach a cliff overlooking the walled-ringed city of pygmies. And raising the small envoy banner, we are taken to the city by a demonic escort. And, as we are taken to the ringed city by these demons, let's reach the discussion of this city through the discussion of some peculiar things related to them. So, quite peculiarly, these lesser Batwing demons who are long familiar to us, seem to be distant relatives of those very great bat demons we had to slay in order to proceed to the ringed city. And I'd say it was very cool to finally see their greater kindred. However, I believe that there might be something even more interesting regarding the lesser Batwing demons. So, we could find these demons back in Dark Souls 1, where some of them served as a similar escort taking us to Anor Londo, while others guarded its majestic streets, which is already quite interesting by itself, as Anor Londo was at war with demons born of Izalith's chaos. And although we could see some other demons used by certain royalty as gatekeepers, for example, the Batwing demons are still quite unique, as they fight using powers of lightning, which is associated with Lord Gwyn and gods of Anor Londo. Lightning is also a natural weapon against many of Anor Londo's enemies, but is not that much of a threat to Anor Londo itself. And since these lesser Batwing demons possess a really high lightning resistance, which appears to be also very unnatural and unique for creatures of chaos, even while chaos itself is unnatural, and also considering their appearance, which is also rather different from other demons, I guess that we may even speculate, though it would be somewhat baseless, that Batwing demons could be actually somehow created by Anor Londo through altering the nature of bat demons they could possibly have taken captive in war against chaos, for example, and, given the powers of lightning, adopted as troops by Anor Londo in order to be used in wars against their chaotic kin or other enemies of the gods. However, despite how interestingly it sounds, it's only a speculation, and since Batwing demons are still called Chaos Demons, though unique ones, it's possible that they were simply unique lightning Chaos Demons without Anor Londo's involvement in their creation or alteration, who, being lesser and weaker than others of their kin, chose to serve Anor Londo. But in any case, I think that the most interesting about these demons serving gods is that it could in fact be a part of a way more common policy implemented by Anor Londo. It seems that, quite wisely, according to this policy, Anor Londo seeks to use its enemies in own purposes if possible, to make them harmless for the gods, loyal to Anor Londo, dangerous to its enemies, to turn its foes into own weapons in war against these or other enemies, either by subduing, possibly altering their nature, or with tricks and deceit. And, of course, we wouldn't be able to discuss this possibility if there weren't other possible manifestations of such policy. And let's begin by talking about a somewhat less certain one. So, in Dark Souls 1 we could also find another creature which was in a certain way similar to Batwing demons, the Blue Drakes, inhabiting the Valley of Drakes not far from the fallen New Londo. Rather peculiarly, obviously appearing to be descendants of dragons, Blue Drakes actually possess powers of lightning and unusually high lightning defense, which of course is very, very weird, since lightning was naturally rather one of the main weaknesses of dragons. And, while it could also be a natural way these descendants of dragons had to adapt to the new reality where they were hunted down with lightning, I guess that considering the location we find them in may lead us to some more peculiar speculations. Basically, Blue Drakes are found beside the sealed entrance to the fallen and forbidden realm of New Londo, which, being seduced by the Darkstalker, went against the god's will and eventually fell to dark, and thus New Londo was flooded and sealed in order to contain the abyss. So, taking that into account, I guess that it's possible that the Blue Drakes could rather be put on its entrance on purpose, as watch drakes of sorts, guarding the sealed entrance to New Londo in case its seal fails and is broken. Which, in its turn, may lead us to even wilder speculation that the nature of these unique drakes itself could be altered by Anor Londo, to turn the descendants of their worst enemy into own weapon. Altered to bear the powers of lightning, dangerous to enemies of the gods, but relatively harmless to lightning-wielding forces of Anor Londo. However, as we find an entire trophy room stuffed with severed blue drake heads in Anor Londo, I guess that they could also be used for gods' amusement as sports of hunting them, which would be way safer than battling the real dragons. And basically the existence of this possibility regarding the origins of blue drakes, along with possible Anor Londo's involvement in the lesser Batwing demon's nature, allows us to speculate that possibly Anor Londo possessed some means of literally turning their enemies into own weapon by infusing their very nature with powers of lightning. Though, again, it's also a rather baseless speculation, and it's possible that the blue drakes originated in a more natural way, while their placement at the gates of a forbidden realm is a coincidence. But even if Anor Londo did possess such means and used them to create living weapons with characteristics of their enemies, the outcome of such involvement results in creatures lesser than originals. But, regardless of rather unclear origins of blue drakes, the Ringed City DLC reveals us another example of alleged Anor Londo's policy of using its enemies as own weapons, which is both a creature more powerful, and an example more certain. Dark Eater Midir, a descendant of mighty archdragons, raised by gods. Though it's not stated anywhere and is just a baseless speculation, I guess it's possible that he was still a dragon egg discovered on a field of gods' victory against the dragons, when the idea to adopt him came to the gods. And who knows, maybe that's the origin of the egg held by the sleeping princess. In any case, gods raised Midir to become an immortal weapon meant to eternally fight the dark, even after the gods themselves would perish. However, as it has often happened in Dark Souls' world, in a way reminiscent of Nietzsche's words, he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Fighting the abyss, eating the dark for long ages, Midir himself eventually falls to the dark. Yet, even stricken by darkness, Midir forsakes not his vow to protect Princess Fillianore, as he follows us, and stays in our way when we attempt to reach Fillianore. And maybe his dedication to this vow is related to some parallels originating from the meaning of his name that we discussed in a patch-leaked content video? And, speaking about Midir, I wonder if his story could somehow, maybe even indirectly, be involved in the defection of the Nameless King? Another thing related to Midir that I enjoyed very much, is the Dark Chasm where he fights his last battle, as it appears to be rather reminiscent of the legendary places where everything started, where in depths of grey world a flame appeared bringing disparity, and those who came from the dark found the souls within the flame. Well, even if it's not precisely the same historical place, but simply a similar area, I still think that visiting such a place in the last DLC would really feel great. And another peculiar thing regarding Midir's fight is that right before the way leading down to the Dark Chasm, we find an altar with a Lothric knight's sword upon a Lothric banner, which not only provides a link between the Ringed City and Lothric, but also is very peculiar since Lothric knights were once known as dragon slayers. However, let's return to Midir, who is explicitly said to be raised by gods as a weapon against the dark, which is quite important when discussing the possible Anor Londo's policy of using what poses them threat in own purposes, turning such things into own tools. However, the most interesting example of manifestation of such a policy is related to humans. And so, we finally arrived at the discussion of the Ringed City and its inhabitants. So, among the souls found within the flame, one of the souls was unlike those found by other lords, the Dark Soul. And it was claimed by but a pygmy in the eyes of gods. Yet, it seems Lord Gwyn felt a threat coming from the dark, as he clung to his Age of Fire, which was bound someday to fade. And fearing the dark, the humanity, Lord Gwyn yet did what possibly seemed like he chose to make the pygmies his allies, rather than to outright fight them, as he bestowed a crown upon them, and granted those who took the Dark Soul an isolated Ringed City, far at the world's end to dwell, and his youngest daughter, to protect the pygmy royalty with her sleep, promising to come for her one day. And thus, pygmies became his lesser allies, or rather something more akin to subjects, but not an enemy to be eradicated, and even fought among the gods who set out to slay the dragons. Yet, it seems that all the gifts could rather be only concealing the true intention, or possibly nothing was intended to be concealed in the first place, as gods had also cast a seal of fire upon the abyss-forged gear of early men, and those who possessed such gear themselves. and it's also said that human contributions in fights against the dragons were never lauded. Well, of course these things were somewhat a speculation written in such manner only to sound better, so please note that. But, what's peculiar, I believe, is that in a somewhat similar way to the policy we speculated about earlier, posing a threat to Anor Londo, humans were, at least partially, turned into gods' tools. They were used against Anor Londo's enemies in war, were made as harmless for the gods as possible, and even in the ringed city where they were isolated, they were placed under certain control and dependence from the gods. For example, in addition to the abyss weapons that were sealed with fire, and on a side note, they look quite interestingly, with these horn-like things reminiscent of those we see on Elderbrew, for example, and also dragon heads possibly, we may face Rin City's inhabitants who use some lightning battle miracles of the gods, which are handy to be used in fights against the enemies of Anor Londo, but are relatively harmless to the gods. Again, the things we discussed about the origin of lightning-wielding demons and drakes are but a baseless speculation, but it still appears somewhat similar to the way how humans got their abyss gear sealed and taught miracles of lightning. Another thing that was curious to me is that aside of numerous ring symbols, similar to that of Sword of Avowal, used in a ritual necessary to the ascension of Lord of Hollows, in Ringed City's architecture, we may also find a very familiar symbol that we discussed in one of my older videos. This symbol could also be found in many places of Anor Londo, and also Oalasile, which, as we speculated earlier, may mean that it is at least one of the symbols of Anor Londo, though it's only so under assumption that this symbol isn't simply a reused content, not intended to bear any particular meaning, of course. However, even more obviously, the involvement of Anor Londo gods in Rin City may be seen on the example of Church of Fillianore. But before we discuss some very exciting things about it in more detail, I'd like to mention certain creatures whom we may find in the Ringed City. The white-faced Locusts, who rose from an abyssal swamp. Their purpose was initially to preach among humans, beckoning them to the dark with sermons. Only, most of them are rather focused on those parts of preaching that refer to feast and partaking, giving little thought to anything but their own stomachs. However, those who do their preaching job properly, reveal in their tales some very peculiar stories that seem to be related to various human characters of different ages we know. For instance, these lines seem to refer to the story of Alva the Wayfarer and Witch Sully.
One was a wayfaring knight on an endless, forbidden search. Only the abyss granted closure, if not reunion with his beloved.
And we may even find them in Ringed City, as Alva's phantom will attack us when approaching the corpse with Zolly's gear. And some of the stories may actually provide some interesting insights regarding the fates of the characters they tell about. For example, these lines seem to refer to Saint Irina, who was accompanied by Eargon, Knight of Kareem.
And so she lived in fear of the dark, of the things that gnawed at her flesh, and yet the abyss hath yet to produce any such creature.
As she was supposed to become a Firekeeper, but couldn't bear all the humanity swarming inside of her. And in the shared grave we get invaded by Moaning Knight, or, quite likely, rather Knight Eargon with his Moaning Shield. As in those catacombs we find a corpse holding a blessed gem, which basically is often used as a charm kept by saints. Thus, I guess it in fact is meant to hint us that it's Irina's corpse. Though, it's rather confirmed by the fact that we're invaded by a Karim Knight with Moaning Shield, which is pretty unique to Eargon, or rather his elder sister. And, as we know, Karimian Knights dedicate an entire career to attending a single maiden. And basically upon his defeat, Moaning Knight drops a blindfold mask that strengthens both dark attacks and damage. Its description tells about its certain resemblance to Firekeeper's mask, but also notes that it's purely cosmetic, and thus, it seems, hints on Irina's fate. And another story.
One poor girl slew her own kin, but even so was embraced, enveloped by the abyss. 'Twas a comfort that neither moon nor sunless sky afforded her before.
Seems to refer to Cirrus of the Sunless Realms. And I guess it's nice to hear that these stories sound like they have at least some abyssal happy ends. But the most interesting, yet somewhat less certain in identifying its character, seems to be this story.
And so, despite his weighty armor, he lived in fear of a delicate thing, little more than a girl.
Well, it's quite a lot of speculation, and basically other theories are possible, but I guess thinking of weighty armor, the first character that comes to our mind is Havel the Rock, who is a sworn enemy of Seath the Scaleless, and thus the story may actually be telling us some peculiar details of Havel's fear of crossbreed girl Priscilla and her life hunt abilities. Though, of course it's quite a wild speculation. However, speaking of Seath the Scaleless and Priscilla, the DLC features a rather peculiar character who may actually be somehow related to these figures. Shira, Knight of Fillianore, Matriarch of the Church. and apparently one of few female knights who fought dragons in the Age of Gods. I believe that we may say that Shira is one of the key characters personifying Anor Londo's involvement, control over the ringed city we mentioned earlier. For instance, it is her who had to deal with an undying mad king once born to pygmy royalty, whom she now guards sealed in a dark room, impaled on her cross spear. But what I'd like to discuss in this video, is that Shira's character somehow managed to become something both expected and unexpected to us. As in earlier videos, when discussing a revealed artwork depicting her gear, judging by her appearance, and later her gear description, we speculated that she may be somehow related to Priscilla and Seath the Scaleless. However, in-game her appearance turned out to be somewhat different, which would normally make many, if not all, of earlier assumptions invalid. Even the certain similarity of her clothes to those of Gwendolyn that we discussed earlier now appeared a little weird, since Shira turned out to be of ordinary human size. But, in the end of her questline, enraged by our actions, she speaks these lines.
I am Shira, daughter of the Duke, descendant of gods, and trusted friend to Midir.
Which are extremely intriguing, as not only she mentions that she's a descendant of gods, but also states that she is a daughter of Duke. And in Dark Souls 1 we actually knew certain character who was bestowed the title of Duke for his treachery against own kin, Seath the Scaleless, which becomes even more intriguing if we note that Shira's crown is revealed to be fashioned with a pearl from man-eater shell. And, actually, in Dark Souls 1 there were creatures who could be described as man-eater shells, and one of the places we could find them was in the crystal caves, right in front of Seath's boss room. So, in the end, with Shira being something not quite what we expected, our wild speculations still appear somewhat possible to be correct. And since we've already touched this topic, I'd like to note one peculiar, yet very uncertain thing to add to the possible meanings of Shira's name we discussed in earlier videos. So, in Japanese her name is written as Shira in katakana, characters commonly used for words of foreign origin, and since sometimes Japanese language doesn't have necessary syllables to represent sounds of a foreign word, in some cases substitutes are used. For instance, syllables with R sound instead of L sound. And thus, while being read in Japanese pretty much as the version of her name from English translation, Shira, the Japanese version of her name could be initially meant to represent a name like Sheila, or possibly even Scylla. Well, I guess we can't exclude such possibilities learning from the name Osros, which ended up being Oseros in English translation, and basically Scylla could be a Latinized version of ancient Greek Scylla, name of a female mythological monster, apparently originating from the word meaning to tear. But, more peculiarly, Scylla may be a name of the squill plant, or a shortened form of name Priscilla. And I believe that Marco Mendix has also noted that name Shira is basically similar to the second part of Japanese pronunciation of Priscilla's name. Though, of course, all of this may very well be just a coincidence, especially since even being possibly related to Seath, Shira hardly is a giant half-dragon girl, but I still felt that it could be an interesting thing to mention. And also, I guess that, even indirect, and almost certainly coincidental, link between crossbreed Priscilla's name and name of mythological monster formed from parts of different creatures' bodies, appears interesting. But let's finally proceed to the discussion of the organization which appears to implement God's will in the Ringed City, in which Shira had apparently been playing a very important role. Church of Fillianore and the Covenant of its Spears. So, Spears of the Church, or Knights of Princess Fillianore, are entrusted with duty to watch over Fillianore's slumber. Being summoned by ancient giant Judicator whenever a trespasser attempts to proceed to the church where the princess sleeps for the sake of others. And ere we proceed deeper into the topic, let's first talk about the divine spear of the church whom we must face in order to reach Fillianore, Half-Light. As, basically, some of the info we shall discuss now will be required for our further discussion regarding the spear's covenant to be complete. So, I guess that one of the most peculiar things about Half-Light is that he actually seems to hail from the ancient land of Oalisile, as Half-Light actually wears the antiquated garb that is really strongly hinted to be from Oalisile. Even this garb's very name is really similar to antiquated dress set worn by Oalisile's princess. And basically the word Half-Light refers to the soft, greyish light characteristic of dawn or dusk, which makes this name very reminiscent of the name of a well-known character who hails from Oalisile. In addition to that, Half-Light uses white birch bough and the unique light manipulation sorceries of Oalisile. And basically the name Oalisile, or, if the assumption is correct, rather Oalisile transformed in result of translation from Japanese Oarashiru, could be originating from Tolkien's Elvish element sil meaning to shine, found for instance in word Silmaril, and possibly ol, to pour, as in name Olmo. Though it's not certain and basically is a separate topic I plan to discuss in another video. However, Speaking of the Wallace Island things we expected from the DLC, in one of the videos I made before the DLC, I took some time to quite baselessly speculate that the DLC might feature something related to Wallace Isle, so I was really excited to find out that not only there is a character from Wallace Isle, but even that the DLC actually reveals that once a mission from this fabled land of gold and sorceries visited the Ringed City. While not much is told regarding the details of this mission, I guess that its purpose was to deliver a message of friendship from Ringed City's pygmies, kindred of culture that had close ties with Anor Londo, and possibly preach among humans who took the dark soul. As, quite peculiarly, we may find one of Wallace Isle's white birches in the Ringed City, while two others may still be found not far from lands that once were a fabled realm of Wallace Isle. These white birches originate from Wallace Isle Princess Dusk's first staff, and are considered to be a token of friendship. And I guess that it's quite likely that Ringed City's birch was brought by the mission as such token. Another point that may possibly hint to friendly nature of the mission, is that the antiquated plain garb found in Ringed City is told to be never intended for battle. And, basically from the very same garb's description we find out that one of mission's younger members elected to stay in the Ringed City, where he even became a spear of the church. And I believe that this missionary is Half-Light whom we face in a fight as we attempt to proceed to Princess Fillianore. But, I believe that we may actually find yet another very interesting thing related to him. The tricky passage to the perching monument of the Ringed City of Pygmies. Basically we find the wall with the text saying "Show your humanity" inscribed onto it. And I really enjoyed this humor that it requires you to literally take a shape of humanity spirit, similar to those we saw spawned during Wallace Isle's fall in the original game's DLC. But that's not the only thing I enjoyed about this hidden passage. So, the first thing is that basically to assume the shape of humanity spirit one needs to use young white branch or chameleon sorcery. And the both ways are actually closely related to the legendary land of Wallace Isle and its princess, for the sorcery itself appears to be born from the mischief of this princess, while the young branches are actually branches of 3 white birch saplings originating from the princess' first staff, and thus, since the tricky passage actually relies upon sorcery of Wallace Isle, I believe that it could be exactly Half-Light who devised it, likely in his duties as a spear of the church. Another thing regarding the trick with this passage that I find quite peculiar, is that while I wasn't able to find any humanity spirits in the swamp area, we are still being turned into them in order to blend in with surroundings. And I guess that it's actually a very neat thing. Because, while we don't see the humanity spirits in the swamp area, we may actually find some crystals. Very reminiscent of dark gems, which are told to be born of disembodied humanity spirits. So, it's only natural for them to be associated with the area, since they had been there at some point even if there is none of them now. I really enjoy such stuff. But, I'd like to note another thing. These statues we find in the Ringed City appear to be very peculiar, as they're somewhat reminiscent of the crucified beasts we find on the Road of Sacrifices. And basically these wooden things we find there, actually seem to resemble the symbol of the Ringed City. Which appears interesting, as in that area, which, it seems, once used to be not far from Wallace Isle, these things seem to symbolize hunts against the abyss-affected creatures. But let's finally return to the discussion of the spears of the church. And talk a little about character who summons Half-Light to fight against us. Judicator Argo. Basically his name seems to originate from ancient Greek Argo, derivative of Argos for white, bright. However, Argos may also be used as alternative form of Ergos for idle, lazy, slow. But, what I find quite peculiar, is that Argos the white originates from Proto-Indo-European Herg of the same meaning. Which is also the origin of Welsh Aryan for silver. And basically in the discussion of the very first hashes of Ariandel trailer we listed Welsh Aryan as one possible roots of name Ariandel. And this possibility is very peculiar and intriguing, given some similarities in appearance of Ariandel and Argo. Though, obviously, it may very likely be simply a coincidence. However, another funny thing is that how this chair and small table beside Argo are somewhat reminiscent of place where Elfried used to sit in Ariandel's chapel. And having that said, let's finally discuss some peculiar things about the Church of Fillianore in general. And basically the Church of Fillianore, both as literal building and a covenant, provides some very peculiar connections to Anor Londo, its gods and covenants. So, most obviously, right on the entrance doors to the church we may see some rather familiar hooded figures with staves. In fact, these figures are pretty much the same that we could see in Erith Hills Cathedral. And, as we speculated in a very old video, they seem to depict no one other than Gwendolyn as a nameless moon deity, since the statues hold staves with the symbol of dark sun and depict pretty much the very same clothes once worn by Gwendolyn, only their faces are hidden under hoods. Which appears rather interesting, as the Dark Moon Covenant once led by Gwendolyn and Spears of the Church are somewhat akin, since both are carrying out the will of Anor Londo's gods, and are meant to punish those who sinned against these gods. But, the figures on the church's entrance doors aren't the only thing that we may note in common between Fillianore's knights and, at least, Irithyll. For the very altar of the Spears of the Church features some headless figures holding spears. But, even though their heads are missing, it's still possible to note that these small sculptures are very similar to the statues of young squires we may find piled up in another church. Church of Yorshka in Irithyll. And, as funny coincidence, we may note that there's Yorshka's spear associated with her church. Basically the statues of young squires depict them holding swords used by silver knights of Anor Londo. Which, I believe, may explain somewhat a weird way the ringed city version of these statues hold their spears. Thus the young squires are apparently meant to become silver knights one day. And, we may actually find some statues of Gwyn's knights across the ringed city, and even get invaded by Silver Knight Bloodo. But, we may actually note another possible similarity, or even link, between the ringed city and Anor Londo, Irithyll, though this one will require a little more speculation. So, as we attempt to proceed to the sleeping Princess Fillianore, Judicator Argo summons Spears of the Church to stop us, and, aside of our flight, we may also face enemies who seem to be the Painting Guardians. Warriors who had been defending the painting of our enemies in Anor Londo long ago, passing down their duty through generations. And, since we could find them in Anor Londo in times when being deserted it was secretly governed by Gwendolyn, and also considering the possible relation of Gwendolyn to the painted world we discussed in earlier videos, I guess that it may be speculated that Painting Guardians could provide a link not only to Anor Londo, but possibly also Gwendolyn. And another very peculiar thing related to them is that in the ringed city we may find some very special throwing blades, very reminiscent of swords used by Painting Guardians. Only, now they're rather associated with the Church Guardians, not the Painting Guardians, which may be speculated to reveal the further fate of Painting Guardians after, apparently, the loss of Ariami's painting. Although, of course, it's also possible that the Church Guardians are warriors of same martial arts as Painting Guardians, but were already guarding the church while others of their kind, more familiar to us, protected the painting. But most peculiar about this weapon is that it actually projects illusory blades, since we may recall that Painting Guardians once resided in Anor Londo in times when its son and princess were already but illusions upkept by Gwendolyn, Master of Illusions. And, although it's quite a speculation, may these illusion-casting blades be somehow related to Gwendolyn's powers? And speaking of illusions, curiously enough, aside of the painting, Church Guardians with their illusory shifts, we also face Half-Light, who uses light-manipulating sorceries of Oalisile. I guess it may make us wonder whether is there any relation between them, as light manipulation sounds like something similar to illusions. And, although it's yet another wild speculation, I guess that the two types of such magic may actually be originating from the same source. As, illusory blades of Church Guardians may be related to Gwendolyn's powers, which is already an enormous speculation. While in ancient land of Oalisile we could find rather curious statues holding the white branches, similar to those we discussed earlier, which were originally used as staves in Oalisile. Looking at these headless statues we may note that they depict some clothes which are already very familiar to us, as, similarly to Irithyll's statues, these clothes appear to be Gwendolyn's robes. So, may it be so that Oalisile, that had close ties to Anor Londo, got its light manipulation sorceries from Gwendolyn, who was known for his illusions and ability to cast sorceries with faith, but not intelligence. And returning to the ringed city, could Fillianore's sleep and its effect on the world be somehow related to some sort of illusions? However, regarding Half-Light's boss fight, though I'd rather call it Judicator Argo's boss fight, even though he is not the boss enemy we fight, I guess we may say that this situation when we are warned not to enter the fog, and are scolded by the enemy for violating the god's will, is also quite reminiscent of Gwendolyn's boss fight in Dark Souls 1.
What foolishness!
Foolishness to forswear thy covenant and the king's decree.
thou shalt not go unpunished.
I shall bring this defiled spear to justice.
Yet, Covenant of the Old Gods fails this time, as we battle our way to the chambers of Sleeping Princess, and as we finally reach Fillianore. Let us proceed to the conclusion of the story. So, touching the fragile embraced shell, and crushing it, we awake the princess of her sleep of deceit, intended to hide the dark souls of Pygmy lords. And by doing so we find ourselves in the world as we saw it in the very first cinematic trailer of Dark Souls 3. A vast ashen desert with ruins under grey sky. Emotions of nostalgia, wonder, excitement grow even stronger as it is also reminiscent of the historical kiln of the First Flame where Gwyn, First Lord of Cinder, guarded Flame. Basically, in my impression, the idea of the area was to give us feeling of finally reaching some truth. And as our journey to the Ringed City began with following Gael's messages, along the path which even possibly was itself paved by Gael for us with his charms in the first place, we reach its finale once again following Gael's steps. Treading through the ashen desert, we stumble upon a member of the Pygmy royalty, as he crawls towards Fillianore, seeking protection, only to die ere finding out that Princess has already perished. He is crippled, his body is all broken, we can see his throat cut open, as Gael slashed it seeking the blood of the Dark Soul. Only, the secret had been kept hidden for too long, and it turned out that Gael went to the very end of the world and even further, only to find that the blood of the Pygmies has long ago dried, and was no longer fit to be used as a pigment for his lady's painting. And so, completely realizing that he was not the champion, and that the Dark Soul would ruin him, Gael still consumes the Dark Soul, to turn his very own blood into the pigment he sought for his lady. And I believe that we should note that it's not only an act of uttermost selfless sacrifice, but also is a token of the enormous trust Gael puts into us. As consuming the Dark Soul, beyond the hope of any safe return, he still believes that even when he will be turned into something else, his duty will be fulfilled, his task will be finished. By us. Gael trusts that despite whatever he may turn into, we shall be strong enough to face him and wrestle the fresh blood of the Dark Soul from him, and bring it to his lady in his stead. And not betraying his trust, we defeat him. And finally bring the pigment to the painter. With this dark pigment she will assuredly finish the painting of dark, cold and very gentle place, and name it after us. But the touching story manages to deal us yet another blow, with these lines.
I wonder when Uncle Gael intends his return. I hope the new painting will be to him a gentle home.
As unaware painter wonders about Uncle Gael's return, while painting a gentle place that should become a place he would be able to call his own, with his very blood. And so, I believe, ends the tale of Uncle Gael, the Slave Knight. But, what I'd like to note about it, though, the following is not even about wild baseless speculations, but rather mere impressions. Is that how we again face this topic of self-sacrifice, which makes Gael's story somehow similar to fire linking, although these are basically two very different, possibly even like opposite, things. Possibly Gael's decision may even somehow be somewhat compared to Gwyn's linking of the fire, as both end up, apparently, not really controlling themselves anymore. And basically we may once again recall this peculiar similarity between Gwyn and Gael in appearance, and possibly even names, as we discussed in an old video. Gael may actually be a shortened form of Gwynael. So, who knows, maybe certain parallel, or possibly contrast, was intended. For example, as during the fight we could see these lightnings striking, only they are very different from those of Gwyn, darker, more real. And, again, who knows, maybe this alleged parallel, contrast between Gwyn and Gael could be somehow related to the return promised to Fillianore. Though, of course this part of the video is no longer about lore, but about impressions, so it was just some impression about thing I liked. And speaking of such things, let's say a few words about Gael's appearance as we see him in the boss fight. Basically, I believe that the intro scene quite intentionally makes us recall Artorias the Abyss Walker. However, it's somehow hard to tell where Gael's fight is somewhat a reference to Artorias, and where straightly to Guts of Berserk manga himself, since Guts was also an inspiration for Artorias. and, basically with repeating crossbow and blinded eye. Some guts-like things can surely be seen in Gael. However, regarding, let's call it, story design parallels, I'd like to note one peculiar thing. Basically, in game's hidden content we may find that Gael and other characters have nicknames of sorts left by developers, probably like placeholders until the official names were picked. And Gael's nickname is Upa, which, I believe, is a reference to Anor Londo of Miyazaki Norseeker of the Valley of the Wind. Sorry for text-to-speech pronunciation. Basically, Anor Londo is a traveling master swordsman and also a teacher of Nausicaa, the young princess of the valley, which already is a little reminiscent of Gael's relation to the painter. In addition to that, I guess we should note that Upa traveled world in search of the secret of the Sea of Corruption, which may be possibly also compared to Gael's search for ash and pigment for his lady to paint a new world. So, I guess that possibly the devs did note, or even intentionally make in the first place, a certain parallel in relationships between Gael and the painter, and Upa and Nausicaa. And I guess it's rather interesting, since it may actually shed some light on the nature of relationship between Gael and painter otherwise not told in game. And, as for more behind-the-scene things, I guess many have wondered, what is the purpose of this tower we've been shown on promo images? As, although it is in the game, we can't actually get to it. And we can even see it in the Ashen Desert as a ruin, yet we can't get to it there either. Well, the answer regarding the purpose of this tower will be not lore-wise, but still. So, basically, there are actually two Gaels during the boss fight. One is Gael of the first stage, and other is of the second stage. While the first one appears only when the boss fight has started, the second one is actually present on the map all along, even when we fight the first stage. And, as you've probably already guessed, this second Gael is being hidden inside of the ruin of the mysterious tower. Actually, I guess we may even see the afterglow of the humanity smoke, fire that comes out from him as he travels from that tower at the beginning of the second stage. And I actually find this purpose of the mysterious tower rather funny and cool. And another epic thing regarding Gael's boss fight I liked, is that how he's able to warp himself using the summoning sign, so it's like he's able to summon himself anywhere at will, and who knows, maybe this ability is related to the black marks we must land on in the Dreg Heap. And, as for other interesting things I liked, of course it was really nice to find these statues of the primordial serpents, that depict their bodies in a slightly more realistic manner, if we may use this term for such things, than those of the Grand Archives. Or, another rather cool thing, is the old moonlight sorcery we get from Midir's soul. Basically, its appearance is a rather obvious Easter egg reference to the moonlight sword traditional to FromSoft's games. However, there is also moonlight greatsword we can get from Osrose's soul. But the effect of Old Moonlight is actually closer to the appearance of the Moonlight Sword in Kingsfield games. And thus its description. The sword is named after Moonlight, but it is slightly different than the one fashioned of the Pale Dreg Sheath. Perhaps it is rooted in an older memory from not long after the beginning. Likely refers not only to the beginning of the Dark Souls world ere the Age of Fire arrived, but also to early FromSoft's games. Well, the video is getting way too long. But, I believe we just can't finish without mentioning one more character. Lapatches. Well, I guess his storyline is one of the best, and even somehow touching, things in the DLC. So, Lap is an outgoing, friendly warrior in a cool-looking armor. We meet him when he's on his way to the Ringed City, in hopes to cure his amnesia with powers of Purging Monument that is allegedly located in the legendary city of Pygmies. Being quite altruistic, Lap is always ready to help us. He even takes all the trouble of going into a dangerous area just to fetch a treasure for us. But, well, having discussed the meaning of his name and speculated about his identity back when it was only confirmed that his name is Lap but not Trap, the intrigue about him was not whether he was Patches or not, but rather, will he, upon restoring his memory, remain true to his new self, or to his old self? Well, of course there was also an intrigue whether was he faking his new good intentions and amnesia in the first place, or he really lost his memory, especially, since being amnesiac and not remembering his own name, he picks himself a name which means patch. And also, the Purging Monument can actually be seen from the balcony we meet him on in the Ringed City, yet, unable to find it, Lap doubts its very existence, though, I guess that if he only faked his amnesia, it would be somewhat too complicated for him to take so much trouble of helping us, to betray only if we help him restore his memory. So, when we find him sitting almost crestfallen in the Ringed City, we may actually reveal him the secret of Half-Light's tricky passageway towards the monument. And, frankly speaking, our next encounter with him is really one of my favorite moments of the entire game. as when we find him in the shared grave, we can subtly see him sitting in a so familiar way. And thus we already know what is going to happen next, even without speaking to him. And I believe that our feeling of nostalgia grows even stronger. The epicness and emotionality of the moment is amplified by the very location it takes place at. Indeed, where would Patches reveal his so familiar true self, if not in catacombs? And so, completely realizing what is going to happen, I couldn't actually wait to follow our Patches' advice. And, quite strangely, the following scene was actually one of the most satisfying to me in the whole DLC.
Every age, it seems, is tainted by the greed of men. Rubbish to one such as I, devoid of all worldly wants. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way we are. I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
It really caused me a lot of feels to hear Patches finally reveal the motivation behind his actions in the final DLC of the final Dark Souls game. And I guess he spoke truth actually, as without memory he helped us not caring about reward. And with memory of terrible grudges he held, he punishes us for being greedy about utter rubbish in his eyes. And who knows, maybe this attitude of his is exactly what explains why he sells literally rubbish item in his boutique of wonders. Maybe indeed he just doesn't see any difference. And part about every age is also extremely peculiar. Who knows, maybe Patches has watched over humans in every age, or maybe every age has its Patches. But the last words are especially epic.
I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
I guess it gives this feeling of something like a message from the developers. Or rather message from Patches, but kind of breaking the fourth wall. Could it be that he waves his hand and wishes us a fine dark soul, as not looking back he's walking away into a new FromSoft's title? Well, like I said in the beginning of this video, this DLC caused me a lot of different emotions and I really liked it. However, the thing that helps me to deal with this sadness of the final DLC of likely the final Dark Souls game, is that I still have some peculiar topics even from the base game to discuss. But, as the video gets way too long, I guess that it should be it for now. Thanks for watching. I know that this video was difficult to watch, but I hope that it wasn't boring to you. And I hope that you might like to check out other of etymology, lore or cosplay videos on my channel. Also, you can check out the video description for a link to the etymology videos table of contents, if you're interested in this topic, as it's meant to make it easy to find the discussion of the necessary names. And what do you think and feel about the Ringed City?